Hello and welcome back to CGB Games. My name is Cameron and today I'm happy to bring you my third devblog for Escape from Violet Institute, a 2D side-scrolling first-person survival horror game. Now, today's first task is a biggie and something I've been putting off for quite some time. Generally in game dev, you are supposed to do the hardest tasks first so that you aren't scrambling to get everything done near the deadline. I like to do this most of the time, but for this particular task I did not. But fear not, I'm juiced up on coffee and ready to tackle this job. Throughout the game there are many cinematic moments that are a little more scripted than the rest. Obviously these can take up a lot more dev time as everything has to run so smoothly without the player having to make the fun for themselves. This cinematic moment sees the player confronted by a group of army men who end up attacking the player. The player is then eventually saved and can carry on with the level. This doesn't sound too hard, but I'm a big believer in giving the player the most freedom possible when playing this game. So I want the player to be able to move around if they want to, whilst this altercation happens. But then this causes a narrative issue. If 3 army men tell you to not move or they will shoot, and you move, they would shoot. So what I have to do is make sure that if the player moves or throws a flare, the sequence jumps straight ahead to the outcome, instead of playing out the full dialogue. The first step in creating this event is the audio and subtitles. I always like to do this first as it helps with syncing everything else, including the animations and other effects. As usual, I collected my voice line clips from the actor, brought them into Sony Vegas, and began adding some effects. This didn't take too long, and once the subtitles were created and implemented, I could move on to the animation for my army men. I initially thought this would take a long while, but after giving it some thought I realised that I only needed to animate the arm carrying the weapon, as the player will not see the rest of their body. This is because each army man is carrying a torch that shines brightly at the player, meaning that the player can only see the bright light. Think similarly to a deer in headlights, they only see the headlights, basically that effect. This works in 2 ways, as it adds a level of mystery to the men and also allows me to work quicker. Once the army animation was completed, I added it to the scene and added a different delay to each of the 2 men. This means that they can all use the same animation, but they will all look slightly different. Once the scene is comprised, it's time to begin the end of the altercation, so what happens at the end. As I said before, when this scripted section is finished, or when the player moves or throws a flare, I need the army men to open fire and the player to be saved. What I've decided to do is have the saviour spawn in front of the player in a puff of smoke and charge towards the enemies and kill them. Here I basically need to give the illusion that a lot of cool shit is happening without having to create anything. I am planning on achieving this with darkness and good sound effects. The smoke that the saviour spawns from will help disrupt the player's view, and with the torches added to the army man's hands, ragdolling all over the place, I'm hopeful it will look very believable. On the sound effect front, I have bullets, screams and blood squelches to work with. Once everything was hooked up to the blueprints, and I tested it out many times, I can finally say I'm happy with the outcome of this scene and I will be moving on to the next thing. I would love to show the scene right now, but it does involve quite a few spoilers, and maybe you just play the game for yourself to see what happens. So the next task today is a little more laid back than the last one, and I'm very excited to get on with it. When the player moves through the newer looking sections of VI, everything looks too nice. It looks way too clean. It doesn't look like everyone abandoned the place in a hurry, if you get what I mean. If everyone were to leave an office straight away in fear of their life, you can imagine that there would be rubbish and papers strewn everywhere. I mean, just take a look at that scene from The Office and you'll know exactly what I mean. So my plan to combat this is to create papers and other rubbishy sort of things that can be littered about the floor, giving it that lived-in feeling. You'd imagine that placing thousands of these meshes will take a long time, which is why I plan to use Unreal Engine's foliage tool to get the job done much quicker. Now that we have the plan ready, it's time to get making. Step 1 is to create the rubbish types in Blender. Now I'll need to create a few of these to stop the litter looking too samey and break the illusion. Firstly I have to make the low poly, followed by unwrapping it and modelling the high poly from it. Then we move over to Substance Painter, where I baked the high poly onto the low poly and then applied a texture to it. I then exported this texture for both LODs, and now I'm done with one foliage type. This whole process was completed a few more times, so that it included many different papers and many different little boxes. I even managed to reuse some assets already created in the game that would be appropriate to. This helped cut down the time taken for this task greatly. The next step is to set up the foliage figures and save each instance so they could be reused on every single level in this area. After that was all done, I played around with the density of each instance a few times until the values looked right and I could finally place them on all levels. This took a little while, as sometimes the papers would be placed in weird areas like above the player or on something they shouldn't do. Other than that, the placement went quite smoothly. And I can happily say that the environments look a lot more lived in now and the game looks a lot more realistic, which is very imperative for a horror game and the type of game I want to create. Next we go to my favourite part of game dev, saving and loading, and obviously I'm being sarcastic about that. It's getting to the point now where I regret making the save and quit function as I did, especially as a solo dev. In hindsight, I wish I had made an autosave every so often, which would have drastically reduced the number of variables I need to save. But I'm stuck with this implementation now due to sunk cost fallacy, so here we go. However, as long as I persevere, I know that this method will make for a better game in the end. For anyone that doesn't know, as it stands, the save and quit function saves the exact state of the game, meaning all pickups, enemy locations and stats, player stats and location, and every interactable ever on the game will be saved. Regardless of all that, I'm getting on with the save on level 18, but luckily it's not a huge level, so I think I have a time for one more dev task after this. So that's all said and done, and now it's time to fiddle with the UI. It's been a long time coming for this one, as the old version is shit and I don't like it. Firstly, we need to start with the 2D UI, which I think will be the easiest to do out of both of them. To start, I will head over to Photoshop and begin designing the layout. I want it to mimic the layout of the first person section with the ammo and flare on the right and the health and keycard on the left. This will make the transitions a lot less jarring and the player will be able to pick up on the similarities between the two. After a little while fiddling and making something I like the look of, it was time to implement it into the 2D section of the game. Once there, I noticed it still looked a little flat, so after heading back to Photoshop I simply dragged the corners inwards a bit to make it look a bit more 3D and as if it was sort of tunneling towards the centre of the screen. Now that I'm happy with the 2D UI, I can go on to the 3D counterpart. Now I know this part will take a lot longer to finish, but I have the 2D template to work from, which should make it slightly easier. Firstly, I need to add the keycard part to the UI, as it has been missing from the first person part up until now. Next we move to the difficult part, which is moving most of the art onto a plane that can be placed in the character pawn instead of a widget on the screen that it's currently on. This change will hopefully make the HUD look a lot more realistic and not like it's just been slapped on the top of the screen. The number counter will still have to be placed as a widget, but there will hopefully be some more tweaks I can do to make it look a bit more realistic. Firstly, I opened up the character in Blender and placed the two planes where I would need them to be in the game. I unwrapped them in such a way so that I could apply different materials to it in Blender so that it could have certain parts that were emissive, basically meaning that when the player looked at their UI, it would light up a bit. Once it was exported, I opened it up in Substance Painter where I created a simple texture. The textures were then exported and I opened them up in Photoshop where I added all the 2D sprites that you can see in the 2D section. Once all this was put together, I could take it back into Unreal Engine and implement it. The next part, which was fixing all the blueprints for it, was definitely the hardest, as there are times in the game when the UI won't show in certain places and it will spark now and then if it's not working. So there was a lot of, I guess, blueprint coding to do to make it all work. After the blueprints were done, I fiddled with the widget a little bit to make the numbers look a bit more see-through so that they weren't just slapped on top of the screen and were actually part of the gun and arm. And after a lot of perseverance, I can now say I am happy with the UI of the game. I would probably have to go back and fiddle with some variables and fix some bugs, but that's just game dev for you. Well, I feel like I've achieved a lot this episode, and I'm happy to leave it here for now. Thank you for watching. If you like the look of this game so far, make sure to subscribe to keep yourself updated. And I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.